Hi, and welcome to this live reading from A Christmas Amish Courtship by Jennifer Spredemann. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. No matter how hard Anne Eicher tried, she couldn't push the thought away. How could it be that her younger Schwester was happily married and she was still at home alone, thanks to Johnny Hirschberger? She stared at the late November snowflakes floating down just outside the window and shoved a tear away. Why was she still crying over him? He obviously hadn't felt the same affection toward her, even though they'd courted for so long. Why had he strung her along all this time only to leave? Yeah, she'd been brave in front of her family because she didn't want Charlotte to feel bad that Andy Stoltzfus, her former beau, had roped his cousin Johnny into leaving the community with him. But if she were honest with herself, she did blame Andy. Sure, he'd left, nursing a broken heart over losing Charlotte to Glen Kauffman. But to take Johnny along after she'd already waited 5 years for him to propose was just cruel. She remembered the day in vivid detail. Andy Stoltzfus had marched into the house as though he lived there. She'd identified several emotions as they'd flitted across his face: anger, sadness, regret, disillusionment. I'm leaving the community, he'd admitted to Anne and her dad. Dad hadn't tried to talk him out of it, but let him speak his mind. Charlotte has chosen Glen Kauffman over me. I can't bear to see them together, to see them wed. I just thought you should know. Then he pivoted toward Anne. I'm sorry, Anne, but Johnny's leaving too. Her mouth had hung open, and it took her a few moments before she could speak, before his words could register. Johnny's leaving? What about the last 5 years of her life that she'd devoted to him, waiting for him until he was ready to begin their happily ever after? What of that? If he'd had in mind to desert her, why had he strung her along all this time? It all seemed so unjust. She'd been beyond ready to settle down, marry, begin a family of her own, but now she couldn't see that happening. And just the thought of showing up at a singing without knowing Johnny would take her home caused the knife in her heart to wedge in deeper. Her days of attending singings were over, a closed chapter in the book of her life. Besides, if her wanted her to marry, surely he'd bring someone along. Who was she kidding? The chances of her finding someone to marry now were slim at best. She'd held out hope for Johnny while all the other maids her age found their matches and were now living their blissfully happy married lives. God, if there was someone out there for me, please make me aware of him. Chapter 1. Andy Stoltzfus had been pondering the situation for some time now. He wasn't sure when the exact moment was that he decided to go through with his harebrained idea. It could have been the moment he'd left the Eichers' home after witnessing his would-be fiancée in the arms of another man. He still scowled as he relived the hurtful moment when he caught Charlotte and Glen in a lip lock under the covered bridge and overheard Glen's proposal of marriage. He wasn't sure why he'd been surprised, though, because if he'd been honest with himself, he'd known somewhere deep inside the recesses of his heart that Charlotte had been falling for Glen Kauffman. He'd tried with all his might to convince himself otherwise, but denying the truth had only resulted in more heartache. He batted the unsavory thoughts from his mind, staring at the pen and blank paper on his desk. He needed to focus. He knew that this was his chance when his cousin Johnny declared he wasn't going to return to the Amish, which meant he wouldn't be returning to Anne Eicher, which meant she was free to court someone else for the first time in over 5 years. But Andy knew he couldn't just show up on her doorstep and ask to court her. Neither could he take her home from the singing. Rumor had it that she hadn't returned to the youth events since Johnny had abandoned her. Besides, he had a pretty good feeling she'd turn him down flat if he asked. The first reason being that he'd recently courted her younger Schwester. The second reason being he'd whisked Johnny away from the community. In her eyes, anyway. He'd read it in the depths when he'd declared their departure. Did she still blame him for Johnny's absence? He hoped that wasn't the case and that someday he'd be able to explain the whole truth of the matter. He sighed, removed his spectacles, and rubbed his eyes. This was more trying than he'd imagined. A simple letter admitting his feelings for Anne was all he needed to write. She could respond how she wanted, or she could ignore this letter altogether. Or what if he wrote a different kind of letter, one where his identity remained anonymous? The idea burgeoned in his chest. A secret admirer. He frowned. Was that too weird? Too creepy, as his younger Schwester would say? No mind. The idea had already taken form, and he was nearly helpless to stop it. He set pen to paper, and the words seemed to flow effortlessly. His eyes scanned the words he penned. God, I pray I am doing the right thing. Please, let this work. Anne reached her gloved hand into the mailbox at the end of their driveway and grasped the bundle of mail. No doubt another stack of Christmas cards. She wouldn't sift through it now, lest the brisk wind snatch an envelope from her hand and send her scurrying across the snow-covered ground to fetch it. She tugged her wool coat tighter and hastened to the house. She would read through their Christmas cards as she sat by the cozy fireplace with a hot beverage in hand. Thankfully, she'd finished all her morning chores and could stand to take a break until the Kinner arrived home from school wanting snacks. Since Ma'am had passed away several years ago, it seemed that Anne had taken her mother's role upon herself. As the eldest doctor, she felt it was her duty and privilege, and now that Charlotte was married off, she'd taken her role even more seriously. After all, Jane and the boys needed tending to. She quickly shed her coat, scarf, and gloves and went about fixing some apple cider. When the Kinner returned from school, she prepared a fresh batch of popcorn, one of their family's favorite snacks and something Dat hadn't minded since they purchased the kernels in bulk at auction. Anne appreciated the ease of popping the kernels and how quickly the snack came together. It had been a staple in the homes of most Amish families, as she knew, for that reason. One never knew when company would drop by and the need for a quick snack would arise. As Anne melted into her favorite chair, she set her cider on the side table and began sorting through the mail. 7 festive Christmas cards, 2 letters, and she stopped when an envelope with her name caught her eye. Turning it over, she searched for the sender's name, but only found a return address, a post office box in Ohio. Ugh, likely junk mail. She opened the fireplace to toss it inside, but curiosity niggled at a place in her mind. She shut the stove door and sighed. It wouldn't hurt to peek inside. After all, the neat writing did appear to be penned by a human hand and not a typewriter. Dear Anne, you're probably curious about why you were receiving a letter with no return name. The fact is, I wish to remain anonymous. For now. We've been acquainted with each other for quite some time now. I've watched you over the years, and I've come to deeply admire you and your commitment to the well-being of others. I've never known anybody like you. I have a proposition I'd like to share with you. This is going to sound strange, and if the idea does not interest you, then I won't write to you anymore. Here's my idea. You and I will write no less than 1 letter a month to each other over the course of a year. In each letter, we reveal something about ourselves. Then, next November, a year from now, if you are agreeable, we will meet in person and marry before Christmas of next year. If this doesn't intrigue you at all, or if it's too crazy a notion to consider, please let me know in your return letter. Sincerely, a secret admirer. P.S. In case you're wondering, I am Amish. Anne scanned the letter again, her mouth hanging open. She had so many questions. Who was this unidentified Amish man who had apparently been watching her for years? She considered all the young men in their district and couldn't imagine who the letter might be from. And he wanted to marry her? She could never marry a stranger, not even one who apparently adored her, which was a little creepy, and, if she admitted, sweet. Why did this man feel the need to send her letters and not engage face to face? Why didn't he want her to know who he was? I felt a little unfair that he seemed to know her, but his identity had to remain a mystery. Well, never mind. She'd set the letter aside and study it again later after she had some time to pray about the matter. She opened up each Christmas card and made a note of each one so she could return the favor. But as she read through the remainder of the mail, the anonymous letter called to her. Married by Christmas next year? The very idea seemed preposterous given the 5 years she and Johnny had courted with nary a solid proposal from him. Married by Christmas next year. The happy thought settled somewhere between her ribs. Visions of holding a Hopley in her arms in less than 2 years played on the silver screen inside her head, and she couldn't squelch a smile. It was a verhoodled notion, to be sure. She didn't know who this man was, but for the first time in years, she felt cherished.